Hi, and thank you for joining today. My name is Ann Battle, and I'm head of benchmark reform at ISDA. I'm joined by Chris Houghton, Jasvinder Singh, and Jonathan Seymour, all of Bloomberg. This webinar is to cover the methodology and Bloomberg publication of the ISDA IBOR fallback. This is the second in a series of 3 webinars that ISDA has published in connection with the launch of the IBOR fallback supplement and the IBOR fallbacks protocol. If you haven't listened to the first or third webinar, I encourage you to do so. Today's webinar, as mentioned, is specifically going to cover the methodology that is used to calculate the fallbacks that will apply if LIBOR or another key IBOR is discontinued or in the case of LIBOR becomes non-representative. It will also cover an overview of the calculations and data that Bloomberg will use to produce the fallbacks, the timing for publication of those fallbacks, and an example calculation. Then we will cover the updates to the 2006 ISDA definitions to implement the fallbacks contractually. And those updates are via the IBOR fallback supplement and the IBOR fallback protocol for legacy transactions, both of which were covered in the first webinar of this series. And finally, we'll give an explanation of how market participants can access the published fallbacks and the relevant commercial terms from Bloomberg that will apply to the fallback. I'll now turn it over to Bloomberg to go through the methodology.
Thank you, Anne. Hi, my name is Chris Houghton, and I am one of the product managers in the Bloomberg Indices team. Today, I will give an overview of the main calculations in the methodology and examples showing the determination of the accrual period for the adjusted reference rate and the median period for the spread adjustment. I will then discuss the timing of these calculations and how this is related to the data required to satisfy the requirements for these 2 periods. Finally, I will then demonstrate the relationship between the offset lag in the adjusted reference rate calculation and the usage of the most recently available rate on an observation date when required by the updated ISDA definitions. As you're aware, the methodology employed in the calculation of the IBOR fallback rates was determined through a series of market consultations held by ISDA. Following on from this, our team at Bloomberg was then tasked with producing the rules that should be followed to implement this methodology. It is important to note that the methodology cannot be changed, and should there be some extraordinary justification under which to consider doing so, a new market consultation would likely be required first. Revisions may, however, be made to the rulebook from time to time, but these would be limited to correcting errors such as typos or enhancing the clarity of the rules by improving the definitions. At a high level, the fallback rate for each tenor of each IBOR is the sum of 2 components, an adjusted reference rate and a spread adjustment. The reference rate is the overnight or risk-free rate, and this is compounded in arrears over a period corresponding to the tenor to give the adjusted reference rate. The spread adjustment, used to adjust for the different nature of the rates, such as the difference in credit risk, is the median of the spread observed between the IBOR rate and its corresponding adjusted reference rate over a 5-year historical period. The value of the spread adjustment is calculated until the cessation of the IBOR is announced, at which point it becomes fixed at the last calculated value. All 3 of these rates, the fallback, adjusted reference rate, and spread adjustment, are published for each weekday. These are the headline formulas for the 3 main calculations that are performed for each IBOR tenor F with respect to each rate record day T. You will observe that the formula for the adjusted reference rate calculation has 3 component parts. Working from right to left, the first component performs the compounding of the reference rate over an accrual period, denoted here by the term AP. This is a standard compounding formula that gives us the product of holding each reference rate in the accrual period from its business day until the following business day. The reference rate is quoted as an annualized rate, so the delta term here gives us the rate for the period between each of these days. Once we've compounded over an accrual period, the rate will correspond specifically to that period. So we apply an annualization factor given by the second term that is effectively the number of times the accrual period goes into a year under the day count convention of the reference rate. Finally, you will have noticed that as we have compounded and annualized the reference rate under the day count convention that it is quoted in, our result to this point is also under that same convention. For the cases where there is a difference in convention between the IBOR and the reference rate, we switch this so that the adjusted reference rate is quoted in the same convention as the IBOR. Prior to the IBOR cessation trigger, the spread adjustment is the median spread between the IBOR and the adjusted reference rate over a 5-year historical period, denoted here by MP. The fallback rate itself is then the adjusted reference rate plus the spread adjustment. The accrual period is that period which the risk-free reference rate is compounded over. The example here is for a 1-month tenor, and I've arranged the holidays and weekends so as to highlight how these interact with the determination of the start and end dates. To determine the accrual start date, we first add the spot lag. This depends on the parameters of the IBOR and the tenor, and here I've used a spot lag of 2 reference rate business days. We then subtract the offset lag, which is always 2 reference rate business days. And in this example, the rate record day is not a reference rate business day itself, and so the start date is adjusted to the previous business day. Note that the rate record day may be an IBOR business day, so we still determine a value for this date. The end date is then determined by adding the tenor to the start date. In this example, that falls on a Saturday, and so is rolled forward to the next reference rate business day. The last reference rate used in the accrual calculation will be that on the preceding Friday, and this will be held until the end date. The reference rate on the end date is not required in the calculation. The median period is used in the calculation of the spread adjustment, and its end date is determined by subtracting the tenor, then subtracting 2 additional reference rate business days from the rate record day. The start date is then determined by subtracting 5 years from the end date. Although the end date will always be a reference rate business day using this method, it is not required that either the start or end date is on a business day, or even a weekday. The observations for the median calculation are any days from the start date to the end date, inclusive of both, that are both IBOR business days and rate record days, i.e. days on which there are values for both the IBOR and the adjusted reference rate. As rate record days are weekdays, this is effectively the IBOR business days. There is also an additional condition that the accrual period for the adjusted reference rate on such observation dates ends at least 2 reference rate business days prior to the rate record day, to ensure that the spread adjustments can be determined on such rate record day. In this example, the end date is the 15th. If we assume we're considering the same IBOR and tenor as in the accrual period example above, you will note that if the rate record day was the 15th rather than the 16th, then the end date would still be the 17th of the following month, and that this is not 2 reference rate business days prior to the rate record day for which we are calculating the median period, and so would be excluded. As the adjusted reference rate, and so also the all-in fallback rate, are determined by compounding a reference rate over a period following the rate record date, these cannot be calculated on the rate record date itself. Instead, they will be calculated once the required data is available. In the majority of cases, this will be on the day corresponding to the accrual end date, but foreknowledge of the exact date of availability is not required, as the ISDA definitions specify that the most recent available rate is to be used in the absence of the rate for any specific day. The spread adjustment for a given rate record day should be available on that date. This is because it is constructed so that no data after a cessation trigger is included in its determination. The diagram shows a timeline of the typical requirements for the calculation of values for a rate record day. In the spread adjustment, the reference rate data required in excess of the IBOR data is that required to complete the accrual periods for the adjusted reference rates up to the median period end date. The 2 business day offset lag used in the determination of the accrual period doesn't guarantee that the fallback rate for a given rate record day will be available on any given observation date. which is typically 2 business days prior to the payment date for an instrument using it. For example, we may have a swap in which one of the cash flows has a reset date of the 26th of February 2019 and a payment date of the 28th of May 2019. So we would need to know the rate corresponding to a rate record day of the 26th of February 2019 by the 23rd of May 2019. For this example, let's consider that already in 2019 we're post the IBOR cessation trigger and using the fallback. In the table, I've listed the accrual period dates for the fallback calculation and resulting adjusted reference rates under offset lags of 2 to 5 reference rate business days. Again, assume we're already post-cessation, so the spread adjustment is a fixed value here and we only need the adjusted reference rate to be calculated in order to determine the fallback rate. You will see that the rate we need for the 26th of February will not be available using an offset lag of 2 until the 28th of May, which is after the day we need to observe it on, the 23rd of May. We would not have the rate in time unless the offset lag was 4 reference rate business days in this case. If I remove all values not calculated on or before the 23rd of May, it is clearer what the latest available rates are under each offset lag. In this case, we get the same result whether we use an offset lag of 4 or use the latest value available calculated under an offset lag of 2. This will not always be exactly the case, such as when there are reference rate holidays between the different offset lag periods, but I hope this gives you a sense of how the combination of the 2-day offset lag in the methodology and the use of the latest available rate in the ISDA definitions interact to determine the rate that will be used. Thank you for your time today, and I do hope that this section on the methodology has been useful for you. If you haven't done so already, I would suggest that you take a look at the rulebook, FAQ, and the worked example for further information on these calculations, which are available under ISDA Go on the terminal or on our website, bloomberg.com/LIBOR. I'll now hand you back over to Anne.
Thanks, Chris. I'm now going to talk about how the fallbacks that Chris described are referenced in the updates to the 2006 definitions. So as mentioned on the previous webinar, ISDA is updating the 2006 ISDA definitions via the IBOR fallback supplement to implement fallbacks for LIBOR in the 5 currencies in which it is published, and those include sterling, Swiss franc, US dollar, euro, and Japanese yen. We are also implementing fallbacks for Euribor, Tibor, Euro Yen Tibor, BBSW, which is an IBOR in Australia, CDOR, which is Canadian, HIBOR in Hong Kong, SOR, and THB Fix. Now, the fallbacks for SOR and THB Fix are not actually published by Bloomberg. Those are synthetic benchmarks that utilize US dollar LIBOR as an input. And so the administrators of those benchmarks are actually publishing fallback rates that will utilize the fallback for US dollar LIBOR as an input. And then ISDA is updating, again, the rate options for SOR and THB Fix to include those fallbacks published by the administrators. As mentioned, the fallbacks will always apply if there is a permanent discontinuation of the relevant IBOR. In the case of LIBOR in the 5 currencies in which it is published, the fallbacks will apply upon the earlier of a permanent discontinuation or non-representativeness of LIBOR in the relevant currency and tenor as determined by the UK FCA. And this non-representative scenario is often referred to as a pre-cessation event for purposes of fallback. So the spread adjustment that Chris explained will be set and frozen as of an announcement regarding a permanent discontinuation or non-representativeness, irrespective of when that discontinuation or non-representativeness will occur. But the fallbacks will not actually apply until the event happens. when that discontinuation happens, the contracts that include the fallbacks will convert to the rates published by Bloomberg. This slide is similar to the timeline that Chris explained earlier, but I particularly wanted to point out event 1 and event 2 on the bottom of the horizontal line. So event 1 is an announcement regarding cessation or non-representativeness, and event 2 is the date on which the fallbacks will actually apply. So during the time between event 1 and event 2, which is unknown, the contracts will continue to reference the relevant IBOR. However, the spread adjustment will be known because that spread adjustment will be based on data for the 5-year period up until the announcement. And as I think became clear in Chris's presentation, it's the beginning of that 5-year period is actually going to be more than 5 years prior to the announcement date, and the beginning date for that period will be based on the length of the relevant tenor. And that's so that the spread adjustment is calculated without any data after the announcement date. So for example, if you had a 3-year tenor, the 5-year period would go back 5 years and would include therefore 5 years of IBOR data, but 5 years and 3 months worth of risk-free rate data to pick up the risk-free rate observed over that 3-month period that would correspond to the IBOR that is published at the end of the first 5 years of that period. And then as Chris explained, you also have an additional lag of approximately 2 business days to ensure that the RFR data is published when necessary to produce the spread adjustment. These spread adjustments are published by Bloomberg on an indicative basis up until an event under number 1 occurs, so up until an announcement. When such an announcement does occur, as mentioned, the spread adjustment will freeze and will not change again. The value of the compounding risk-free rate will continue to be published on an indicative basis until event 2 occurs. And the all-in fallback that is published beginning on event 2 is the fallback that is referenced in the updates to the 2006 definitions. So those updates, unlike OIS that uses a formula within the relevant compounded rate options for SOFR, SONIA, etc., the fallbacks use a price source, and that means that the relevant rate options direct to the counterparties to look at what Bloomberg publishes for what will be the relevant observation date and utilize that rate. So all the materials that Bloomberg and ISDA has made available make that calculation quite transparent. However, from a legal perspective, what is binding as the reference rate to be used in the contracts is what Bloomberg publishes for the relevant observation date. So this slide elaborates on the contractual mechanisms that Chris alluded to for counterparties to use when determining what fallback rate to reference in their contract. So the IBORs are observed at the beginning of the relevant period. They're typically observed either on the reset date or 2 days prior to the reset date based on the relevant IBOR. Because the fallbacks utilized a compounding in arrears version of the risk-free rate, the fallback rates will not be available until the end of the period. So while the rate options in your contracts will remain the same, the observation date will shift from the beginning of the period to the end of the period. So if you look at the updated rate options in the IBOR fallback supplement, you'll see references to the original IBOR rate record day. And that is what you'll find on the Bloomberg screen each day. In some cases, you'll see a fallback for one original IBOR rate record day. In some cases, you'll actually see fallbacks for multiple original IBOR rate record days. And in some cases, there will not be a fallback published for an original IBOR rate record day. But in any event, the original IBOR rate record day that matters for counterparties trying to determine the fallback rate is the day that they would have observed the relevant IBOR, whether that is the reset date or the date that is 2 days prior to the reset date. So if counterparties were to observe an IBOR on April 1st, and that IBOR is for a 3-month tenor, they're going to be looking for the fallback rate published by Bloomberg around the beginning of July, and they're going to be looking for an IBOR with an original IBOR rate record day of April 1st. So they're not looking for it on April 1st, but they're looking for it at the end of the period, but tagged to or with an original IBOR rate record day of April 1st. And specifically, the updated rate options provide for counterparties to look for that fallback rate with an original IBOR rate record day of April 1st on the date that is 2 business days prior to the payment date. And payment date is a term that counterparties negotiate pursuant to their confirmation. So counterparties look at the payment date in their confirmation. It will typically, for an IBOR contract, be at the end of the relevant contract, at the end of the relevant calculation period. But nevertheless, whatever that payment date is, counterparties will go back 2 business days. Business days can be defined in the relevant confirmation, and counterparties may or could, going forward, define business days with reference to a local market to ensure that their new observation date is at least 2 local business days prior to the relevant payment date. If counterparties don't specify business days in the confirmation, then the 2006 ISDA definitions will implement a default business day, for example, London for pound sterling LIBOR. So the new observation date becomes the date that is 2 business days prior to the relevant payment date. So counterparties go to the Bloomberg screen or wherever they're accessing the Bloomberg fallback rates on that date and look to see whether an all-in fallback rate for their original IBOR rate record day is published either on or prior to that date. So they basically just look to see if it's available at all. It doesn't matter if the fallback rate for the original IBOR rate record day was published on a prior day. As long as it's available, that is their fallback rate. If, however, say the new observation date in the example that I'm using was June 29th, so counterparties go look at the screen on June 29th, and the last fallback rate that Bloomberg has published is for an original IBOR rate record day of March 30th. So Bloomberg's publication hasn't reached the fallback rate for April 1st because of holiday calendars and the other eventualities that Chris described. In that example, the fallback rate pursuant to the contractual language would be the fallback rate for an original IBOR rate record day of March 30th. And as Chris mentioned, in most cases, that would be akin to having a 4-day backward shift instead of a 2-day backward shift. So what this mechanism allows for is to utilize a 2-day backward shift whenever that's possible, and only utilize a longer backward shift when it's necessary for counterparties to make the payment that they need to make. I did want to mention one more thing before moving off this slide. if in my example, the counterparties looked at the relevant screen at the end of June on the date that is 2 business days prior to their payment date, and Bloomberg had, published on that day an all-in fallback rate for an original IBOR rate record day of April 2nd, and the day before they'd published a fallback rate for an original IBOR rate record day of April 1st, which is the original IBOR rate record day for the contract. Counterparties would use that previously published fallback rate for April 1st. They would not jump ahead to April 2nd. So you always use the relevant day if it's available, no matter when it was available. You only go to a different day if you need to go to an earlier date because of what's available on your new observation date. So we covered some of this in the first webinar when we talked about the IBOR fallback supplement, but I did want to mention that the IBOR fallback supplement also contains provisions for dealing with a scenario in which certain but not all tenors of an IBOR are discontinued, or in the case of LIBOR, become non-representative, but there are remaining shorter and longer tenors that continue to be published, and in the case of LIBOR, are representative. In this case, the updated 2006 ISDA definitions provide for use of linear interpolation of the remaining representative shorter and longer tenors instead of use of the all-in fallback rates published by Bloomberg. So in that case, if, for example, 1 week and 6-month LIBOR remain, 1 week and 6-month US dollar LIBOR remain, but 3-month US dollar LIBOR and other tenors are discontinued. If your contract referenced 3-month US dollar LIBOR, you would use an interpolation between 1 week and 6-month US dollar LIBOR until one or both of those tenors is discontinued. And in that case, the index cessation event would actually be the announcement of the discontinuation of 1 week or 6-month US dollar LIBOR, assuming there isn't any remaining shorter or longer tenors. So assuming those were the only tenors that continue to be published, your index cessation event for your contract that referenced 3-month US dollar LIBOR would be the announcement relevant to one or both of those tenors. And then the actual discontinuation or non-representativeness of one or both of those tenors as applicable would be your index cessation effective date, on which the fallbacks that Bloomberg publishes for 3-month US dollar LIBOR would become the reference rates in your contracts. And that's consistent with how Bloomberg is going to be calculating the indicative spread adjustments. So if that scenario occurs, Bloomberg would continue to publish dynamic indicative spread adjustments for 3-month US dollar LIBOR, utilizing the interpolation between 1 week US dollar LIBOR and 6-month US dollar LIBOR as the input in that spread calculation for the 3-month US dollar LIBOR. So in that case, the comparison would be between the interpolation of 1 week and 6-month US dollar LIBOR compared to SOFR compounded over each corresponding 3-month period. So what you're using in your contracts would be consistent with how Bloomberg is calculating the spread adjustment, and then Bloomberg would freeze the spread adjustment when there is an announcement regarding the cessation or non-representativeness of 1 week and or 6-month US dollar LIBOR. The updates to the 2006 ISDA definitions made by the IBOR fallbacks protocol also include mechanisms for calculation periods that are non-standard, to which linear interpolation applies, or other non-standard calculation periods if the tenor of the rate to be used in that calculation period is longer than the period. And those provisions are necessary because in the case of linear interpolation, you could have a scenario where the fallback rate, because it's available at the end of the period, for one of the rates that is to be interpolated is not available until after the end of the non-standard period, or in the case of a non-standard period that just references a longer tenor, you would always have a situation whereby that fallback rate is not available. And so the updated definitions provides mechanisms to have a rate to use in those contracts. I'll now turn it back over to Bloomberg to go through access and commercials for the fallback rates.
Thank you, Anne. I'm Jas Singh, and I'm one of the product managers with Bloomberg Indices. I plan to cover two aspects today. First is our phased approach to the rollout, and second, how you can access the content from us. On the phased rollout, we have a three-phased rollout for IBOR fallbacks. We went out with the first phase on July 17, 2020. This is where we came out with a work-in-progress product. It's especially so that our clients can have a look and feel of this content. Several weeks following this go live on July 17th, we entered into our second phase. This is where we continue to enrich the user experience with this data. For example, there are several enhancements that we are making to functionality on the terminal for the user experience. The third phase is where we continue to make enhancements, such as having calculation time available for our users. Let me now segue into how you can access the content. There are four key channels through which you can access this data. First is Bloomberg Terminal. Second is Bloomberg's data license. Third, our LIBOR transition website. And fourth, the authorized redistributors. Let me now spend a little bit of time on how you can access this data on the terminal. There are several places on the terminal where you can look at the fallback data. So there are three that I can focus on here today. First is FBAC Go. This is our landing page for this data set. You can access each of the roughly 200 tickers which span across adjusted RFR, spread adjustment, and fallback rate across the currencies and tenors on this page. The second is HP Go, which is for historical price. As Anne mentioned, there can be scenarios where multiple rate records days are published. You can access the historical values, including the rate record days, as well as the calculation days on this page. The third is the fallback spreadsheet. This is where you can use Bloomberg API to bring together this content. The second channel is Bloomberg's data license. There are two ways you can access the data here. First is per security, and second is bulk product. For per security, for each of the roughly 200 tickers I mentioned, you can choose one or multiple of these to access value for a given date or for a historical date range. For the bulk data sets, these are aligned to the 11 IBOR fallback rates that we would be publishing, or 11 data sets. You can access the related content on a go-forward basis or as a historical product. The last is Bloomberg's website. This is publicly available content on a 24-hour delayed basis. With this, I'll hand it over to my colleague John Simmer to talk you through the commercial details and certain additional resources. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Jonathan Seymour from the data strategy team at Bloomberg. The commercial usage terms. A license is required from Bloomberg for the redistribution or the usage of the ISDA fallback rates, including the component parts, the adjusted reference rates, and the spread adjustments. There are three types of license available: a redistribution license, an infrastructure provider usage license, and a firm-wide usage license. The usage license essentially permits firm-wide enterprise usage of the rates for multiple purposes, primarily as the fallback in a financial product and including the valuation, pricing, and risk of instruments. This global firm-wide usage license includes all affiliates. It's a basic structure whereby there's no counting of users or numbers of products. The annual redistribution license fees and the usage license fees for infrastructure providers apply from the data subscription to the data. An infrastructure usage license is for companies such as clearinghouses, exchanges, benchmark administrators, and index companies, and enterprise technology providers. Annual usage license fees for firms are waived. That is, all other firms aside from infrastructure providers. These fees are waived until the earlier of the end of the first quarter of 2022 or the index cessation effective date for any of the IBORs in accordance with the 2006 ISDA definitions updated. Excluding infrastructure providers, usage license fee waivers will also continue to apply for smaller institutions with assets below $5 billion US, be that assets under management or balance sheet assets, for those firms that subscribe to a single rate set, for example, US dollar LIBOR fallbacks and all the rate tenors within that. For the license fees, payable from the data subscription, the vendor redistribution license fee is for real-time and delayed data, $50,000 annually. For delayed data on a 24-hour delay is $10,000. The infrastructure provider usage license for a single rate set, for example, US dollar only, $50,000 annual fee. For more than one rate set is a $100,000 annual fee. From the effective date of the fallbacks, this is the fees that will apply for an infrastructure provider usage license in the case that such entity is a government agency or a not-for-profit benchmark administrator. The same fees apply, but they will not apply until the actual fallbacks kick in. And for all other firms, the firm-wide usage license, the fees do not apply until the effective date of the IBOR fallbacks as well. For a single rate set user, the annual fee is $5,000. For a two or more rate set user, for a financial institution, will be $20,000. And for two or more rate sets for a non-financial institution will be $10,000. As I mentioned, a single rate set user firm with assets below $5 billion will continue to have the fee waived. Finally, I just wanted to mention some additional resources available to look at either on the terminal at ISDA Go or RFR Go and on the Bloomberg website at bloomberg.com/LIBOR. You will find we have the rulebook, a set of frequently asked questions, a sample calculation of how the fallbacks are constructed, some technical notes on the data sets available, a fact sheet as well, and the list of the tickers for each of these fallbacks, adjusted reference rates, and spread adjustments. I'll now hand it back to ISDA for some concluding comments.
Thanks, Jonathan. So this slide also contains links where you can find additional information about the IBOR fallbacks, including a comprehensive set of information about the market consultations over the last several years that ISDA utilized to develop the fallback methodology, There is also a link to where you can adhere to the IBOR Fallbacks protocol in order to include the updates to the 2006 ISDA definitions in your legacy derivative contracts. Thank you to everyone for joining today, and thank you to my fellow panelists from Bloomberg.